Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Charles Moscowitz, live here at YouTube, Facebook, Periscope, Twitch, and other locations. Gary Goldman was supposed to be my guest. He couldn't make it at the last minute. He's going in for some medical exams. He'll be with me next week. I've got a bunch of things lined up for next week. It should be a very interesting week. So I'm flying solo, and you're welcome to join me, of course. Call in if you're listening live, 617-396-4830. 617-396-4830. I might as well continue a bit on the conversation I was having yesterday with regard to whether or not there is a conspiracy, a grand conspiracy to take over the world. In the literal sense, my answer is no, but in the philosophical and broad sense, my answer is yes. And in fact, I would suggest that that conspiracy today is more dangerous, more lethal, more threatening than ever because of the development of modern technologies, starting, of course, with the nuclear bomb, which ended World War II, and then advancing now into computer science, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, all of these technologies, which in the wrong hands very well could be used in a sinister manner to subvert the entire planet and its freedom. Edward Snowden was a whistleblower on that. He pointed out that under the Obama administration, the government literally was spying on everybody. It could look at every single keystroke on your computer. It could listen in on your smartphone. I think that the Obama administration expanded this. Obama himself obviously was a control freak who was spying on Trump, right? That's what those FISA documents were all about, trying to get the goods on his enemies. But the situation is obviously problematic because of the nature of the quote unquote conspiracy. What is it? The conspiracy is basically something that it's organic. It is not literal in that it's not a bunch of people, getting together in a secret room somewhere and hatching it. It's more, I think, the conspiracy of gentlemen as discussed by Whittaker Chambers. This idea that people think alike, that they have achieved a level of power, of wealth, and of influence, and that as such they can coordinate informally to fulfill their demented and evil plan. That is a rejection of the sovereignty of the individual, the sovereignty of the Lord God, King of the universe, the sovereignty of all of the institutions of freedom that foster and advance individual freedom, like faith in God, like religion, organized faith, in many of its different guises, particularly Judeo-Christian faith. The right to own property, the right to free trade, the right to all of the things we almost take for granted in this country are things that they are subtly but determinedly trying to undermine. They can't do it outright because it runs against human nature and because they're afraid that they're going to wake up the beast, which, by the way, they did in a sense with the presidency of Donald Trump, and there are other things around the world. The reassertion of sovereignty in Europe, Brexit, getting out of the evil European Union. I'm not going to get into that too much other than to say that while there's nothing wrong with a free trade agreement and a common market between European nations and a normalization of relations, there's an agenda in the European Union to create a one world or to create a regional power with a united Europe, and that's wrong. And by the way, that is exactly the agenda of our establishment. We learned from, for example, the release of the Hillary Clinton WikiLeaks emails, which is very interesting, by the way. However it happened, that she is on the record privately as saying that she believes in a Western Hemisphere informal union of the United States, Latin America, and Canada. That she's one of these people who wants to, she views borders and national sovereignty as some kind of a negative thing, as an anachronism. It's old-fashioned, after all. We should try something new and advanced and enlightened, where we all live together in peace and harmony and everybody's goose-stepping to the same message, and there's no more strife. We've abolished it. We've abolished war, you see. Now, when I say that, it's not because I like war. I hate war. I don't think we should be in wars at all, unless we're invaded by a foreign power. Um, but I recognize that human nature being what it is, and with a dark side to human nature, there's probably going to be wars, just like there's going to be any other form of conflict, just like there's going to be people ripping you off. You know, the reason you have your car locked outside right now, if you're listening, is because you know that somebody could break into it and steal it. That's human nature. Does that mean I like stealing? I mean, no. I mean, it's just recognizing that human nature has a dark side, which is all the more reason and all the more argument for and in favor of sovereignty of nations, a concert of nations, that because it's an international means of balancing power, reducing power, making sure that too much power is not all in the hands of one nation, which can then conquer the world. And that the official public reason why the United Nations was established was to simply be a diplomatic office where small nations of the world could hash out conflict in an atmosphere of security and peace, not what it actually is, and I think anyone who studies it, which is something that is under the control of this New World Order crowd that wants to use it as a government of the world. And anyone who looks at the founding of the UN sees that there were a lot of either communists in it, or there were Americans who were pro-communist in it. The founding Secretary General of the United Nations Conference in San Francisco was none other than Alger Hiss, who was later proved to be a literal communist, and who was unmasked by Whittaker Chambers, who at the time was his Soviet handler. A very famous trial, 1948. They called it the trial of the century. Kind of blew the lid and the whistle on all of these amoral, corrupt, insider, deep state, creatures that inhabit the high levels of our government, of our culture, and even of our churches. So we're getting another glimpse at this deep state with President Trump, and we ought to take heed of it. We ought to understand it. Yes, there is an agenda to use the levers of power and wealth and influence to informally control the world. Now, what about one area that I didn't get into yesterday that I kind of was thinking about afterwards, and I'd like to touch upon today, and I want to touch upon it in a very careful way, and that is the influence of secret societies on this phenomenon. Now, it is difficult to talk about secret societies because they're secret. We don't know what's going on inside these societies because we can't know. It's secretive. There are some of these societies may be quite benign. Others may not be. We don't know this. I don't know it, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend I do. I'm very suspicious of people who do like to pretend that they know what the hell is going on inside secret societies. However, I would suggest that as an outsider, it makes sense to me, it seems obvious to me, that secret societies do and continue to play a role in this internationalism and in this international order, and in some of these very strange things that are going on in our politics and culture that seem almost inexplicable and yet that are promoted as good. And that includes big wars, that includes such weird and demented policies as opening the border and letting, people just come across illegally, go on welfare. Things like infanticide. You have now my own state of Massachusetts passing a law that expands abortion rights. What do they need? Do they need more abortion in Massachusetts? No, they want to expand it to a very radical agenda, an extremist agenda. And I think most Americans who are pro-choice, by the way, would be horrified by this if they understood it. And that is that you can actually abort, or I should call it murder, which is what it literally is, a child born as a result of a botched abortion. That very strange governor of Virginia, Ralph Northam, talked about this on a talk show after he was elected. I think that he was himself a pediatrician or he's a doctor who may have even been involved in some of these things, where he said that if the baby is born, you put the baby in a comfortable place and let it die. That's called murder. I mean, even like recently, that is something that was detested by everyone, except maybe a radical core of insiders, the very conspirators we're talking about here. And the fact that states are now legalizing this, this is something that hasn't been legal on any nation's books since the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, who used to put the baby would be born and they would bring the baby to a local judge. That judge would decide whether or not the baby was going to be useful to the state, and whether it could be functional. And if the judge decided not, then they would put the baby on a hillside to die. Even the ancient Romans got rid of that. They found that abhorrent. So we're talking about resurrecting an ancient pagan practice here. And I would suggest that even a few years ago, this would have been unthinkable to most Americans. And now, it's being embraced by the entire Democratic Party. They actually voted down a simple bill in Congress that would have said that we want to protect the life of the born baby. I guess that's not good enough for them. And a year or so ago, I predicted to my family, actually, in discussion, that I thought that the next agenda on the frontier of the denigration of human life after transgenderism would be pedophilia. And I still think that's coming down the pike. I really do. I think that within the next 3 to 5 years, maybe, we're going to see the normalization of pedophilia. It's already happening. But I didn't expect this. I didn't expect infanticide. This one came out of the blue. So you can never tell what this secretive world order establishment is going to come up with. And when they do it, they make it, they're so cunning and so controlling of all of their mandarins in the media and in the culture and in academia, that they can pull it off. And they can do it in a way that almost is indecipherable. And people at this point have been trained so thoroughly to not think for themselves, but to internalize their own sets of morals, given they have any, that they not only go along with it, but they don't even think about it. They don't examine it. They just react. Oh, this must be good, because this liberal governor who hates President Trump said so. So I'm on that side. So this is the advancement of this agenda, and it's informal world control, politically, economically, and spiritually. I laid that out yesterday. Check out yesterday's YouTube video and podcast. But just today, I want to just add the question of secret societies. I don't know how far back they go. It makes sense to me that they exist, of course, we know that, but that they have influence because, when you have people getting together in secret, you don't know what's going on. They can plot anything. I mean, you can have a bad element infiltrate that society and use it. And that's exactly what Adam Weishaupt did in 1776 when he founded the Order of the Illuminati, which was a reaction to and a rebellion against the Jesuits. It was a Catholic movement. And that his movement, his agenda there was to infiltrate Masonic lodges and get into the very inner portico of these lodges, so that average people who were members of the lodge really didn't know these secrets. You had to go into the various degrees of Masonry until you got to the very inner core. And the process of getting to that, you would be screened and vetted by the inner core, who would decide whether or not you were going to be the right person to do this. So, by the time you got maybe to the 33rd degree or whatever it is, you were ready to accept this agenda. That was what Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati did. They infiltrated and they took over these lodges. Now, the reason we know about Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati is because in 1786, around that time, a courier who was carrying papers for the Illuminati was apprehended by Bavarian police, and those papers were exposed. And so we understand their agenda. It became public, and it was a huge scandal in Europe. He was exiled from Bavaria, where he ended up finding a sponsor who I think was the Duke of Hesse, or of one of the German principalities, where he lived the rest of his life, and he continued to be active, and he continued to write books, and he continued to spread his poisonous ideology. Now, what was that ideology? According to these documents, which would later be used to create a series of books by Abbe Baruel, The Rise of Jacobinism, it was to undermine the church, undermine the aristocracy, undermine government, and replace it with a new world order, basically. And I think they even used a variation of those words. And that it was made up of high-level intellectuals and academics and business people who would find ways to subvert the existing order to move it in that direction. Now, around this time, by the way, or I think it was actually maybe a little bit before the Illuminati of 1776, I think it was 1689, around that time, King William of Orange returned and was restored to the throne of England, where he chartered the Bank of England under Paterson. And the Bank of England was really the world's first central bank, and that led to a transfer of the ability of sovereign nations to create their own currency and their own economic systems to the hands of private bankers and businessmen in each country, who would then intersect with other banking houses and central banks, and they would assume the power informally to control the value of our money. This, I think, it's a big subject. I'm not going to get into it today. I'm going to have an expert on it, but I believe this is what led to World War I. And probably, of course, World War II was just a continuation, ultimately, of World War I. It led to depressions. It led to the stock market crash of 1929. This is actually a subject that has been openly discussed by economist Milton Friedman. You can look at his YouTube videos. Brilliant man. And basically what it is that these private central banks, in the United States it's the Federal Reserve, in other countries it's other banks, have the power to manipulate the value of our currency. So this was part of this transfer of powers from sovereign nations to private individuals who would interact with each other. This is what Adam Weishaupt was talking about when he talked about world order. Not necessarily, one government where you have a king sitting in a castle somewhere and ruling the entire world. It's informal. It's what Hillary Clinton was talking about in her email when she wanted to have end of borders in the Western Hemisphere, and free trade and free passage by anybody who wants to travel. We could go through many examples of this. H.G. Wells, the English author. There's a lot of people in the establishment who have written about this and talked about this. It's an amazing history. There's been a lot of books written about it. You can just do your research on that. It's too much to get into right now. I want to get back to the issue of secret societies and their influence. Of course they have influence. Why wouldn't they have influence? They're secret, and they're made up of powerful people. And some of their influence could be good. I don't know, but it makes sense to me that they're bad. Now, I'm going to just give my theory here, and I'll leave it where it is. You can decide for yourself. I don't know. I'm not claiming to be an expert here. I'm matching my hand to this. I'm not claiming to be an expert here. I've read on it. I've studied it. I could be way off base here, but I'm going to lay it out. I believe that the Illuminati, which is considered settled history in Europe. I know in this country, when we talk about the Illuminati, people think you're kooky and you're wearing a tin hat. I think that's part of the agenda, frankly, of diverting people's attention. But I think that the Illuminati did lead to the French Revolution. My source on that is not only the Abbe Baruel and his book History of Jacobinism, but also John Robeson. He was a professor at University of Edinburgh in Scotland who wrote a book called Proofs of a Conspiracy. A letter that was written by President George Washington in his first term to an inquiry about whether or not the Illuminati had infiltrated his Masonic lodge. He didn't think so, but he also recognized that the Illuminati is a diabolical agenda, and he knew all about it. So this is, this letter is actually on display, I think, at the Masonic Lodge in Alexandria, Virginia, which Washington attended. And there's a lot of other history of this. In the 1920s, there was the murder of Captain Morgan, who was about to spill the beans on what he considered to be a radical infiltration of Masonry in upstate New York. He spilled some secrets on Masonry, and he was punished by being murdered, and his body was buried in the shallow waters of Lake Ontario. That led to a national scandal and the creation of the Anti-Masonic Party. There were very prominent people in that party. It was America's first third party, including John Quincy Adams. It was that party that patented the idea of having primaries and conventions. They had a lot of innovation. They eventually morphed into the Whig Party, which eventually morphed into the Republican Party. So, Americans have always been concerned about the phenomena of secret societies and the fact that you can have prominent people, whether they be in politics or in culture, taking oaths of loyalty to these secret societies that supersede oaths of loyalty to their country and even to their families. It bothers me actually that I don't know. You could have a police chief who is an oath taker in a secret society, or a judge, more like, in a secret society, who then has a defendant in front of him who may also be a member of that same society. Is he going to be impartial? It gets into, can you have loyalty to the Constitution? When you take an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, and you're also a member of a secret society, which oath supersedes which? I think these are real questions. But the point I'm making here is that these secret societies, I believe, do have influence. Getting on with my theory here, I think that the Illuminati was successful in terms of infiltrating lodges in Europe. I don't know if they made it as far as the United States, at least not initially, but I think that they did play a major hand in establishing societies in France that led to the diabolical coup that took over the French Revolution. Now, I should point out here, just as a quick matter of history, that the French Revolution itself occurred without firing a shot. What happened is that King Louis XVI, in 1789, agreed to set up the Estates Générales, the parliament, for the first time after many, many centuries, and agreed to allow that Estates Générales to craft a constitution. That, in a sense, literally turned him into a constitutional monarch. He ceded absolute power. That was the French Revolution. He was a very popular figure, by the way, in the United States. It was France that aided the American Continental Army under Washington with finance and with military help. Lafayette was a French general from France, obviously, as was Rochambeau. They were the right-hand men of Washington. It was the French Navy that defeated the British Navy off the coast of Yorktown, the Battle of Chesapeake. It was the only naval battle that the French won over the British. And it was that battle that allowed Washington to hamstring General Cornwallis at Yorktown. And he surrendered. That was the end of the war. It was up. And that was, the French deserve a lot of credit for that. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin spent the Revolutionary War years in Paris, where they were admired, where they were in contact with the French people and with the French government, where Jefferson helped craft what he hoped would become a French Constitution. In other words, the American movement of independence and freedom and the removal of tyranny and the move toward natural rights and all of that, that was what the French people thought they were getting in 1789 when Louis XVI accepted the constitutional monarchy. But that's not what they ended up getting because of subversion, because of these Jacobin clubs and because of other subversive, secretive clubs that honeycombed Paris at the time and that fomented violence and takeover and eventually led to the Reign of Terror, which was a coup d'etat, and which was the world's first communist revolution that also witnessed the first outright genocide when the directorate under Robespierre slaughtered the countryside of the Vendée because they were Catholics. So, not to mention the priests and every other enemy of the people. That was the world's first communist revolution. In fact, it was the first time the word communism would be used publicly by French revolutionary Gracchus Babeuf. So this was hatched by, I would suggest, these secret societies, which I would suggest were linked to the Illuminati, at least informally. A good book on this topic is none other than the book called Fire in the Minds of Men by James H. Billington. James H. Billington is the Librarian of Congress. I don't know if he's still there. He was appointed by Ronald Reagan. He was a Russian expert. He was an advisor to several American presidents, particularly Reagan, who he accompanied to Russia. He was a Russia expert. And he played a major role in helping to defeat and destroy the Soviet Union. This is one of America's most respected scholars. His book, Fire in the Minds of Men, from the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution, is all about these secret societies and their influence in Europe and how all of this culminated in the Russian Revolution. Now, I'll just say one more thing about this, strictly my opinion here, but I would suggest that these illuminated lodges, however they became that way, whether it was directly from the Illuminati members or not, and I think it's reasonable to assume that they were, that they created a secret society in Germany in the 1830s called the League of the Just, and that was the society that hired Karl Marx as a pamphleteer to write the Communist Manifesto. They changed their name to the Communist League at the time of the publication of the Communist Manifesto in 1848, just in time for the series of revolutions which took place and which broke out in European cities around the continent. I also would suggest that a group of these same illuminated figures came to the United States and set up a secret society at Yale University called the Skull and Bones. Now, that was the mother, I think, of all of the American secret societies. It's been called the America's Secret Establishment by Hoover Institute fellow Anthony Sutton. It has included presidents and secretaries of state and people in very high places of influence. And I think that is America's branch of the Illuminati. That's my opinion. I don't know. I don't have evidence of it, frankly. How could I? I don't know. I've never joined anything other than the local YMCA. I don't know from secret societies. So I'm simply expressing this based upon things I've read over the years, people I've interviewed over the years, and also simple common sense that secret societies exist and that they have influence, and that this is clearly a secret society. The other branch is the British branch, which was established by Cecil Rhodes, who became governor of South Africa. He was the magnate, the diamond magnate, Boer Diamond Company, which still exists and which regulates the value of diamonds by restricting its production. He set up secret societies that the Round Table groups, which were made up of very high-level British elitists. This is a subject that is written about by Professor Carol Quigley, who was at Georgetown University, who was mentor to Bill Clinton, who wrote a book called Tragedy and Hope in the 1960s, and who talks about Cecil Rhodes establishing these secret societies that sought to create an Anglo-American establishment, an informal union of the United States and Britain and the British Commonwealth, who would be the superior group that would rule the world. It was totally based on Darwinian eugenics, this idea that the Anglo-Saxon race is superior to all other races, including, by the way, the Irish, and that they would rule the world for its own good. This society, after World War I and the failure of the League of Nations, which was entirely a secret agenda, frankly, they established two major outposts in the world. One in London called the Chatham House, or the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and one in New York, which is called the Council on Foreign Relations. And these two groups have provided the intellectual firepower and the personnel ever since for most governments in the Commonwealth and in the United States. The Royal Institute has also had spin-offs in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, British Commonwealth countries. And the Council on Foreign Relations, of course, has satellites around the United States. They publish a scholarly journal called Foreign Affairs. And most American secretaries of state have been members. They're responsible for a lot of America's wars around the world, including the Vietnam War. I mean, there's an interesting video out right now hosted by Robert McNamara, former Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson, who was one of the architects of the Vietnam War, which was very much a Council on Foreign Relations agenda. It had nothing to do with either not going to war or winning. It had to do with this idea of constant, perpetual international wars as a way to weaken the United States, turn the United States into a province of the world, reduce our moral standing, because that's what war does, and reduce our numbers, quite frankly. They're very much into so-called population control. I mean, that's what the whole abortion agenda is all about, but that's another subject. Suffice it to say with Vietnam that, the United States fought World War II pretty much single-handedly. I know we had allies, and the Russians came in after their ally Hitler double-crossed them. I get that, and tied them up on the Eastern Front. And of course, China tied up Japan on their front. But nevertheless, the United States was the main player. And we defeated world empires that were very determined to create a new world order on two fronts, and did so in a short span of time. It was about 3.5 years. Whereas in Vietnam, it went on for 14 years, and nothing was accomplished. They reached a stalemate, which eventually was sold out by liberals in Congress, headed up by Ted Kennedy, but that's another subject. The point is that, why did that happen? We find out in the 1980s that there's a release of these so-called rules of engagement, which these bizarre rules that a U.S. Air Force couldn't bomb a North Vietnamese plane until it was confronted by it, and all these other things which hamstrung our ability to engage in the war. So I'm not in favor of the war. I'm not saying we even should have gotten into it. Maybe we shouldn't have, probably shouldn't have. But if we were going to get in it, we should have done it and won it within a year at most, and it would have been a minor story on the scene. Instead, it took 14 years. It created enormous domestic discord. It contributed to a complete diminution of our culture, of our nation, of our men in uniform. It opened up the counterculture and the occult and all these other poisons into our system. And I think that was deliberate. I think that was part of the Council on Foreign Relations plan. And we could point to many other disasters that they have led us into. I think President Trump rejects them, by the way. I don't know that, but I think so. And that, of course, would be amazing. Anyway, so yeah, secret societies, they have a huge influence on our politics. And it is a sinister influence. And that it is very much a part of this agenda of creating an informal world order. Anyway, I want to thank you for listening today. Check out my books. They're available at Amazon.com. Charles Moscowitz. They show I've written about 15 books. And of course, I would ask you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, please. You know, it doesn't cost you anything. If you don't like it, you can unsubscribe anytime. But my understanding is that for me to really get this program moving along, I have to get subscribers. And I think that as it is, I suspect that I'm being shadow banned. I've been told this by a number of people, that given the program I'm doing, I should be much further along at this point in terms of numbers of subscribers. And there's a reason why I'm not, which I can't prove that. I don't know that, but I think it. So anyway, please subscribe to me on YouTube. It's anonymous. As I say, I don't know who you are when you do it. It's free, and you know, you can get out anytime you want. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, everyone. Charles Moscowitz. I got a pretty good lineup next week, so stay tuned and have a great afternoon. Thank you.